wife Lillian, who will talk to you about one aspect of Florida history, not necessarily about this area.
Okay, thank you. Okay, could we have the lights turned down because we've got some pictures to go with this. And I could be out of everybody's way here.
Oh, it's not working.
Let me tell you that I'm so excited to do this today because one of the things that I learned in Casselberry and writing my book about my father and the days of Casselberry in Central Florida from the 1920s all the way till the time Dad died in 1969 was how much went on. And then I had all this information. Well, you know what editors do? They said, people will stay long for this much. You have to cut all that out. I didn't want to. But today you get what they wouldn't let me tell you. The truth is out. Fame, fortune, and fraud in Florida. This is the 1920s. Now I often wondered why in the world my dad got caught in the 1920s and why he couldn't see this boom coming. It was just about ready, the bubble was about ready to burst. Couldn't he see it? Well, how many of us saw 2007, 2008 coming?
No, nobody.
Okay? Well, then I had to put myself back into my father's shoes, and I got into this. The early days of the 20s of the land boom, there were a couple of South Florida cities that were competing. And they were competing for this: money, dollars, and development, and all the things that they wanted that they could do with that. They were Miami Beach, Coral Gables, and to another degree, Boca Raton. But let's start back in the late 1800s. Longwood was already going. Miami was nothing but a river town. But there was one woman who thought it should be more. That was Julia Tuttle, and she enticed Henry Flagler to bring his railroad all the way down to Miami. Now, she gave him enough land to make it worth his while, but she also wanted the foundation laid for a city, and she wanted a hotel so he could bring wonderful, wealthy guests with this, the money, and they would come down. She said, we'll name it Flagler. He was not too sure about what this town was going to be. He said, keep the name Miami. It's an old Indian name, just keep it. Well, he didn't know about the future of it, but Julia did, and she was going to make sure Miami got built. Not far away, on the other side of Biscayne Bay, a man by the name of John Collins came south from New Jersey. He was a horticulturist, and he was looking for money. He was looking for the $5,000 he invested in a coconut grove on the beach. And he couldn't find anybody except a couple of other investors who also got stuck there. And they were all tending the farm. It appears the original investor, Mr. Lum, had taken off. So after a while, Collins' sons and son-in-law came down to Miami Beach, and they looked around and said, what in the world are you doing here? They said, I'm growing avocados. Land is good for avocados. I can make a living on it. And they looked across Biscayne Bay, and they saw on the other side of Biscayne Bay, Miami was now 15 years old. They were having parades, floats, and celebrating and decorating, of all things, automobiles. The boy said, look, Dad, you're missing the whole thing. You need to be a land developer. But to be able to make it profitable, first you need to be able to get them all over here. So you need to build a 2.5-mile bridge all the way from Miami over to Miami Beach. Then you can charge them. Okay, a couple of years later, he was doing just that, and then he ran out of money, and he started looking for more. down Biscayne Bay, there was a man by the name of Carl Fisher running up and down there in this speedboat. He was having a grand old time. He had a millionaire. He worked his way from the bottom up and had sold his company, Prestolite, to Union Carbide. But he couldn't stand sitting still, so he came to Florida. Collins said, look, I've got a deal for you. I will give you 200 acres of beachfront property if you will give me $50,000 so I can finish this bridge. It's only a half a mile away, but I have no other way to get it here. Now, Fisher knew the impact that the automobile was making in development. Not only had he sold his company that was automobile related, he had been instrumental in the Indianapolis Speedway's development, and he had taken the first route over to the Lincoln Highway. That was one of his pet projects. So now Collins had enough money, and he decided that this is going to be it. He got everything going. In 1913, the bridge was finished. Collins was already working on his next plan, how to get people from the north down to Miami Beach. Well, he had this great idea. He was going to build this thing called the Dixie Highway. It was bricks because you could lay them down fast. It was only one way because he didn't care how people got back, just as long as they got all the way from Michigan straight on down to where? Miami Beach. Of course. Across the bridge over near Miami, there was a dreamer. There was a young man whose father had a grove of about 160 acres. And while his father was alive, he had gone to Rollins College, and then he went to New York to study law. And he came back, and he was working the farm. And he decided that he had seen something in all of this land, and he wanted to make his area perfect. So he took that 160 acres, and while he was working it, he was also subdividing it. His name was George Merrick, and his dream was Coral Gables. And he was very frugal in the beginning. He waited till 1921 when he got $1 million. $1 million in the bank, and then he started working on his dream. Meanwhile, back across Biscayne Bay, Carl Fisher had a problem. He was not patient. People were not flocking down as fast as he wanted them. He wanted speed, 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 and they just were not coming at his speed. So he was really a great promoter. He brought in a battery of press agents. He gave them sun, sand, sea, and sex. Yes, he invented the first bathing beauty advertising. He was a man, actually it was his wife that came up with the idea for it, but he's known for it more than she was. And so there were bathing beauties. They were all on billboards, especially up north in the winter. It's always sunny in Florida. He also decided that this is working, I'm going to go get an elephant. So he bought Rosie. Rosie was a hit with visitors of all ages, and she even had a chance to caddy for President-elect Warren Harding when he was visiting. After a while, Miami Beach became the place that you just had to see to believe. There was no other way. And people brought their money. Okay.
Your money's from the
They're just getting away from it. They brought their money and they came south. And started to flow in. Well, Merrick was doing pretty well with his area. Coral Gables was growing. And then it really began to get just enticing to people up north, and he got a contract to develop a $10 million Biltmore Hotel right in Coral Gables. It was going to have a country club, golf courses, polo fields, tennis courts, and an enormous pool, the Venetian pool. Soon, Merrick had 86 buses roaring up and down Flagler Street, bringing northern people from their hotels right on out to Coral Gables. And there he would put them in gondolas, actual real gondolas, so they could glide through the canals. That's how he got fill for his land. Out of there, that's how you got gondolas. You got the gondolas to go through the canals where they dredged to be able to put sand up on the otherwise swampy lots. And everything was just going really well for him. When the Biltmore opened, it was a grand time. Merrick paid William Jennings Bryan, known to most people as the Great Commoner, to float on a raft under an umbrella in the Biltmore's Venetian pool and preach the gospel of real estate. Bryan said, you can wake up in the morning and tell the biggest lie you can think of, and by the time you go to bed at night, be ashamed of your modesty. That's what he was selling. Now let's go a little further north on the Atlantic. Addison Meisner has already developed Palm Beach, and his latest plan was Boca Raton. At that time, Addison Meisner was the most flamboyant developer and an architect in the state, and just about anywhere anybody could think of. And he got a hold, with his syndicate, 1,600 acres of land and about 2 miles of oceanfront real estate. Now, for him, Boca Raton would be the world's most architecturally beautiful playground, with luxurious mansions for the creme de la creme of world society. Not just America's, the world society. But what Meisner had that made him truly legendary was a marketing director. His name was Harry Reichenbaum. Some call Reichenbaum the most gifted mob psychologist since P.T. Barnum. He had an idea of how to get plenty of sales to Boca Raton. He said, get the big snobs and the little snobs will follow. Now, Addison Meisner had a real con man for a brother, Wilson. Wilson said, that's the platinum sucker trap. And when they sprung that platinum trap several months later, Meisner drew in blue bloods like the Vanderbilts and the DuPonts, celebrities like Irving Berlin and Elizabeth Arden, and even royalty, and they all bought. They bought so much that the first day sales were over $2 million. And at the end of 9 months, 2 weeks, it was $9 million in sales. Now this is the dollar that we've been talking about. But like every dollar and every coin, there's another story. How did it get this way? And what was going on? When you were looking at this, what was going on behind it? For this story, we have to step back to 1913. And these books are how I know what I'm about ready to tell you. Panic in Paradise, Dreamers, Schemers, and Swindlers, Only Yesterday, and The Creature from Jekyll Island. That's my history that I depended on. Otherwise, nobody would believe this. Yes, what happened was there was the automobile. There was the highway, the Dixie Highway that brought people down. But really, there was an influx of money from a new cartel of bankers called the Federal Reserve System. It was established in 1913. And they were going to make it easy for the government to never run out of money. They were established on December 23rd, 1913. The next summer we were in a war, the Great War. But not to be outdone, Florida bankers had a scheme of their own. They wanted their influence heard. They decided that they were going to have the banker form of government. That's because they had just elected a banker, Governor Warren Hardee, to be their governor, and he had a plan. The Hardee administration passed Florida's no estate tax amendment and the no income tax amendment. Why? Because the agenda from bankers was to attract all this money down to Florida, get it into their banks, borrow from their banks, not have to pay any income tax or profits. So that was what they did. But for it to turn out as big as the Florida land boom was, it took real organization. And here's how they did it. Politicians became bankers. Bankers became politicians. They borrowed money from their own banks and invested in real estate developments. Developers took out newspaper ads, that makes the newspaper owners happy, and they spread the hype. Then when the buyers got there, the promoters took over and they promised easy money. So when they got all that going, the bank regulators were still not accounted for. So they were bought off. They wanted loans so they too could invest. They didn't want to be left out. And that's how everything came together. And it was so hard to unwind or to even see. Because if one was lying about it, the other was lying about it too. And they kept the same story going and going and going. There was nothing wrong with Florida no matter what happened. Now let's come back to the present day, 1925. And Boca Raton has just busted wide open. Northern bankers for years have seen their deposits go and take a one-way trip south. They were not liking it. They had been screaming about it, but nobody was hearing them. Finally, they went to the Federal Reserve and said, look, we're Federal Reserve members. Why aren't you listening to us? Federal Reserve listened to them. They went to the government and said, this is going on down here. You need to do something about it. What could you do? They went to find the money in the form of IRS agents looking for unpaid taxes on all those profits. And when that happened, everything turned to a whisper. There was no boom anymore. Well, without the boom, or it being much slower than it was, the railroad decided, hey, we've got a lot of equipment that's just worn out. We need to stop and do some repairs on it. Well, there was a lot of builders who had not finished their buildings. They needed to finish. They needed to have the supplies so they could finish the building, so they could get their last draws. I mean, they were getting desperate, as were suppliers, because they wanted to get the things down there so they could get paid. Everybody was chasing the dollars. So soon, windjammers and rusty schooners became normal. They were coming to life down on the old rivers, and they were coming from wherever. Leaky hulls were crammed full of lumber, steel, and hardware, and they all headed for Miami and Miami Beach. There was an old schooner, the Prince Valdemar. It was headed for Miami Beach, or for the Miami Harbor, and when it got there, it was so heavy with materials that it couldn't get through the canal. So what did the crew do? They started throwing things overboard so it could lift the boat off and they could get in. Well, it capsized. They must have been throwing it all over one side. When it did, it sat like that for over 3 months in the middle of the harbor, and no other boat with all its freight could get in. It was a total bottleneck. Now up north, things were not going so well for the state of Florida, for the advertising, for the fact that things weren't getting done. And then one of Meisner's investors, a man by the name of Senator, politician, Coleman DuPont, money, and he started looking at this and he said, wait a second, no more of this. I just read what Reichenbaum put out about Boca Raton. This is fraudulent. Reichenbaum had written, no existing world resort of wealth and fashion compares to Boca Raton. Sounds good. But the only building in town was a hamburger stand. Coleman DuPont was furious, and he discredited Miser's company and took him to court. That was when things really started to fall apart. There was so much going on that the Florida machine could not keep up with it. They could not deny it. Now remember that Florida bankers were state bankers. They weren't most of them weren't part of the Federal Reserve. They were part of a state chain that was active in Florida and Georgia. And when this got too heavy, there was a bank run from depositors at Miser's favorite couple of banks. They started taking the money back, and then they finally, the tellers were locking themselves in the cages. They couldn't stand the mobs outside. When that happened, it was only the beginning. In the middle of July, 1926, 117 banks in Florida and Georgia closed their doors for good. It was just too big to deny. People had lost their money, and then when you get 3 hurricanes, one major one, the Great Miami Hurricane, but 2 other ones in the same year. And people who were there took whatever money had been stolen by the thieves or invested or whatever they could get out from under their mattresses, and they went back north. Because you know what was cooking up there? A sure thing, the stock market. And they wanted in on that. They wanted in on that. So what happened to those dreamers and schemers, the people who made Florida what it is and what it was, a great place for some, an unhealthy investment for others? Henry Flagler won the award as the biggest, best, longest time developer that Florida has ever seen. Nobody has ever done as much for Florida as Henry Flagler did with his railroad, bringing it down. Plant tried to on the West Coast. Florida won. He died at 83. Julia Tuttle, she didn't have much left when she died because she gave so much away to Flagler to try and get Miami started. And she was forgotten for a long time. But in 2012, the city of Miami erected a 10-foot statue in her honor as the mother of Miami, but she was also the only woman to ever found a city. John Collins. John Collins lived to be 90. He had a successful avocado grove, and he made a lot of money. For a while, it was the biggest avocado grove in the world. That was 1922. By the time he died in 1928, things had changed a lot. But he had money, and he did well. But he was a horticulturist, a grower. Casinos and all that, they didn't bother him. But he had the money. Then there was developer and master promoter Carl Fisher. In 1925, before the boom went bust, he had $100 million in assets in Miami Beach. When the boom cracked, he took the land off the market. He didn't believe anybody else should take the risk. He would take the risk. So he took the land off the market, and he went north. But he wasn't much of one for sitting still. When he got out to New York, he went down and he saw a place, Montauk, New York, and he bought land there. No, should never have done it. Because by 1929, he was totally wiped out. Between carrying the mortgages on what he had in Florida and everything he'd invested in Montauk, wiped out. His last development, interestingly enough, was in Key Largo. He went down there and he developed this little fishing place called the Caribbean Club. He figured it would be a resort for fishermen of modest means. He was certainly in that bracket now. And he died in 1938, I believe, no, 39. 8 years later, after his death, that was the location of Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall's Key Largo, and it is still standing today. So as a promoter, he would like to see that something really happened that he can be remembered for, although unless you read the plaques, you're not going to know it. Coral Gables, dreamer, George Merrick. He dreamed too big. During the 1926 bust, he had faith that Coral Gables would get through it. Now, he was always afraid of having Coral Gables turn into a city. He didn't want it because he knew he would lose control of it. But it had turned into a city. And by 1927-28, those 1,000 houses that he asked to be built, some of them for $100,000 back then, those were now in foreclosure. The city commission was not real happy about having all these foreclosures around the city. He was on the Board of Commissioners, and they took him off. He had to leave town. Sooner or later, like about 1940, he ended up as a postmaster somewhere down in the Keys, one of the islands. And when he died a couple of years later, he was only 55. He had about $400 in the bank, still hadn't paid off all his bills. But the postal employees were the ones who were his pallbearers. And the most interesting thing I found out about George Merrick was one of his first moves as postmaster was to give women equal pay. And now back to Boca Raton. Woo, what happened there? Meisner came north to Orlando in Winter Park. There's some of his houses around here. But a court appointed a trustee to dispose of the company's assets. One of his original investors bought out all the assets. He paid $71,500 in cash and assumed $7 million in debt that Addison Meisner left. But when Meisner was ill, near death, he had still wealthy friends. They loved him. He had sparkling blue eyes, quite a wit. Wilson Meisner, his brother, always kept people laughing. It was a jolly old time for a lot of people. And they paid for his living expenses in Villa Meisner in Palm Beach. That's where he died. He was a pauper, but he still lived the way he spent the rest of his life, getting money for other people and living to the hilt. It's a lot to learn about Florida, and it was fun following the money. I enjoy that. It's always a good exercise. But what I've learned about Florida is we've always had our share of dreamers, schemers, and scallywags. We've had our booms and our busts. And Bernie Madoff with his Ponzi scheme, the first Ponzi scheme came from Charles Ponzi back in the 20s. So there's a lot of things that come around and time again. We just have to be wary of them. But Florida is always the place that is the last to go down and the first to come back after a bust. Because you know what? Sunshine never goes out of style. Anybody have any questions?
What was DuPont's purpose in getting involved in that?
Everything sounded good. He had already done Palm Beach. The schemes were all underneath. You don't see what's going on. You see development. You see pretty pictures. You take gondola rides. In Miami in 1925, there were over 25,000 registered real estate agents in Miami. And they were all over the place. But what you need to know about that is it was so much that people couldn't absorb. They couldn't look past all the frenzy there to stop and ask what's going on. Everything showed profit after profit after profit. Somebody buys a lot today at $50,000 and turns it over to the next sucker at $70,000, and then it keeps going and going and going. And that's a lot of what happened. There were so many people that were just put out a stand and sell subdivisions in the city of Miami that the city fathers had to stop and say, you cannot open a plat on the streets of Miami because it would cause a car crash. It would. There was just so many people who would stop. They wanted to see what was going on. It got way, way, way out of hand.